Grief is hard, but getting good grief support doesn't have to be. That's why I love text-based grief support from Grief Coach. For less than the price of an hour's therapy, Grief Coach sends you thoughtful tips and resources about life after loss all year long. Texts are curated by grief experts and authors and can be customized based on relationship, cause of death, and more. You also receive personalized texts for grief anniversaries and special days, and extra support around the holiday season. And if you have friends or family members who want to help you grieve but aren't sure how, you can add them to your subscription and Grief Coach will text them grief support tips and reminders of your important dates, because no one should ever have to grieve alone. Sign up for Grief Coach's text-based grief support today at grief.coach/ShelbyForsythia. You can find a link in the show notes. Hello and welcome to Grief Book Roundup, a podcast where I introduce you to a grief book I love in 10 minutes or less. I'm Shelby Forsythia, an intuitive grief guide and author who helps grieving people come back to life after devastating loss. My mom's death in 2013 made me a student of grief, and I'm perpetually reading books related to loss, transformation, and finding your way after everything falls apart. Here, I'll share them with you. On Grief Book Roundup, I'll introduce you to grief books new and old, highlight marginalized authors and underrepresented grief stories, and remind you in whatever loss you're facing, you are not alone. Let's get to today's book. Hello there, grief growers, and thank you so much for joining me today on Grief Book Roundup. This week, I am bringing you one of my favorite books on grief called Second Firsts by Christina Rasmussen. Second First was one of the very first books that I ever read after the death of my mother in 2013, and reading it again recently for this show, I can see why I was so drawn to it after her death. I think at the time, I needed a book that was both achingly compassionate and crystal clear about what I needed to do to live life after everything fell apart. Using a combination of psychology and brain science, Christina Rasmussen helps shift the mind's focus from loss and grief and the old to life and everything that is new by framing life after loss as an ongoing series of second firsts, doing everything again, learning life again for the second first time. Her book reminds me that because I've experienced grief, my new life has nothing to do with, and can have nothing to do with, the life that I lived before loss. While there is huge cause in that for sorrow and mourning, and this is so much of what we focus on in grief, it is also a great invitation to creativity and novelty and joy, recognizing that no one can save me but myself on the path of grief and loss. Christina Rasmussen provides a map and actionable steps forward. If I had to pick 3 words to describe this book, they would be imaginative, attainable, and uplifting. Imaginative because in the wake of us, readers, not being able to imagine what a good life after loss would entail, or a happy life, or a full life, or a joyful life, or whatever adjective you'd like to insert in that space, Christina Rasmussen delivers us stories from her own life, but also stories from clients that she's worked with in her Life Reentry Institute teaching Second Firsts. She tells stories of people recovering from divorce, of people recovering from these major losses of identity, these major losses of people that they love, and stepping into this invitation of creative, joyful, happy, full lives that they never thought they could possibly live in life after loss. And so Christina Rasmussen steps in and offers this imagination where maybe we can't right now in our grief. Attainable because the combination of brain science and psychology that Christina Rasmussen uses brings all of the airy-fairy imagination right down to the ground. She says, here's the steps, here's the actions, here's the journaling prompts, here's the questions you need to be asking yourself, here's the way you set up your life so that you can practice living life after loss in these small, teeny tiny possible ways that make going towards your life after loss a doable and achievable thing. Lastly, uplifting, because the entire tone of this book presents life after loss, a life of second firsts, a life after the very worst happens, as a thing that is not only possible, but definite for you. And so if you're living with doubts, she speaks to and addresses that. If you're ready to go, she speaks to and addresses that. If you've started but you're not sure where to go next, she speaks to and addresses that as well. The entire time you are reading this book, Christina Rasmussen is helping you build what she refers to as the launch pad into your life after loss. And so it is literally uplifting you from where you are now to where you would like to be in the future, and then makes that future your present reality. In terms of losses included in Second Firsts, Christina Rasmussen frames much of the book around the loss of her husband to colon cancer when she was just 34 years old. She also covers majorly the loss of identity and the grief of an old life that you can no longer return to. In addition, there is an entire section on what Rasmussen calls, quote, invisible losses, including the loss of an intimate confidant when a partner, a child, a spouse, a sibling dies, loss of security, and loss of friendships and family relationships in the aftermath of a loss. Some favorite quotes from this book. This is a nice long one from page 16. She writes, "The day I accepted how different I had become because of my grief and realized I was no longer the person I used to be and that I could never go back, a doorway opened. I stepped through it into a new life that had the potential to surpass my most ambitious dreams. I was no longer someone who lived her life just like everyone else. I was no longer thinking in the same way as my friends, my family, and my coworkers. I was no longer talking, acting, and feeling the same. So I stopped trying to fit into the old life I had left behind, and I found that my pain lessened. My new self was no longer trying to match my old surroundings. Trying to remake the old life was what had hurt me the most." And I also love this quote from page 40. It's a lovely reframe on some really hard emotions that we can have in grief. Rasmussen writes, "What you feel as emptiness is life's new home. And what you feel as loneliness is the urge to hold life's hand again." And my whole soul loves this as a reframe, because we can diagnose our emptiness, our loneliness as bad, negative. I shouldn't have these. But to Christina Rasmussen and her framing in this book, emptiness and loneliness are signs that you want to be a part of your life and a part of the world again. And she provides such a lovely framework to do that in Second Firsts. Thank you so much for joining me today on Grief Book Roundup. You can find a link to buy today's book in the show notes for this episode. If you'd like to submit a grief book for the show or buy one of my books on grief, visit shelbyforsythia.com. You can follow me on social media at shelbyforsythia on Facebook and Instagram. If this podcast helped you find your next great grief read, be sure to subscribe and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. And if someone in your life has experienced a loss, be sure to share this show with them, especially if they love to read. I'm able to purchase grief books and keep this podcast on the air thanks to my amazing Patreon supporters. If you'd like to support Grief Book Roundup on Patreon through a yearly or monthly pledge and access live grief support calls and workshops hosted by yours truly, visit patreon.com/shelbyforsythia. Music for Grief Book Roundup is performed by Owen Phillips. Until next time, I see you. I am so proud of you and the work that you're doing in the world. And I love you. Because even through grief, we are growing.